The temperature drops long before most people notice it. Not outside, that part is obvious. Frost settles on rooftops. Car windows turn opaque. Breath becomes visible. But the real shift happens inside the walls, inside the systems, inside the assumptions that hold modern homes together. Because once winter arrives, something else begins. The constant fight. Heaters switch on, then off, then on again. Warm air is created, lost, and reheated. Energy moves in one direction, outward, always outward. Through walls, through windows, through tiny unseen gaps no one notices until the bill arrives. And it always arrives. Higher than expected. Higher than last year. This is considered normal. Homes are not built to hold heat indefinitely. They are built to slow its escape. Insulation delays loss. It doesn't stop it. Heating systems compensate. They don't solve it. So the cycle continues. Heat is generated. Heat escapes. More heat is generated. Every winter, the same quiet drain. Now imagine something different. No constant system running. No bursts of hot air. No sharp shifts between rooms. No overnight drop forcing everything back on. Instead, the temperature holds. Not perfectly, not unnaturally, but steadily, comfortably. Even as the outside air falls toward freezing, the interior barely reacts. Not because it fights harder, but because it barely fights at all. At first, this doesn't make sense. Everything about modern housing teaches the opposite. Warmth is supposed to be produced. It comes from gas, electricity, fuel. It's something you manage, something you pay for. Remove that input, and the expectation is clear. The house gets cold, but here, it doesn't. That's where the contradiction begins. Step outside, and the difference is immediate. Wind cuts across open space. Surfaces freeze. Everything behaves exactly as expected. Step back inside, and it's gone. Not because the system is working harder, but because something else is happening. Something quieter, slower, something that doesn't rely on constant correction. This stability feels almost unnatural at first. People are used to reacting, adding layers, adjusting thermostats, moving between rooms. But here, those reactions fade, because the changes themselves fade. Morning feels like afternoon. Night feels like morning. The edges between temperature shifts blur until they're barely noticeable. And that's when the deeper question forms. Not just how is this possible, but why isn't this normal? Because the benefits aren't subtle. No constant system cycling. No mechanical strain repeating all season. No dependency on external supply chains just to stay warm. And most importantly, no rising cost tied directly to survival. The warmth exists without the usual pattern behind it. And yet, homes like this remain rare, not unknown, not impossible, not even experimental anymore, just uncommon, which creates another contradiction. If something works, reliably, predictably, why doesn't it spread? The usual answer is complexity. People assume it must be expensive, specialized, difficult to build. But that assumption doesn't last, because the structure itself isn't the mystery, it's the behavior, what you feel inside, or more precisely, what you don't feel. No sudden drops, no sharp rises, no constant need to intervene. Just a steady baseline that doesn't demand attention. Modern housing has trained people to expect instability, to expect adjustment, to believe comfort requires constant effort. Remove that effort, and it feels like something must be missing. But here, nothing is missing. If anything, something has been removed. The need to constantly correct the environment, the need to fight it. So the question shifts again. If heat isn't being produced, if it isn't aggressively maintained, then where is it coming from? Because it has to come from somewhere. It always does. But whatever that source is, it doesn't behave like anything people are used to. It doesn't switch on. It doesn't cycle. It doesn't respond instantly. It simply holds, quietly, consistently, almost as if the structure itself isn't generating warmth, but preventing it from leaving. And that changes everything. Instead of asking how to create more heat, the question becomes something else. What if the real advantage isn't producing warmth, but keeping it in place so effectively that you barely need to produce it at all? It sounds simple, too simple, but simple doesn't mean obvious. And it doesn't mean widely used, because following that idea leads somewhere unexpected, not to a machine, not to fuel, but to something much older, something that has always been there, something most homes are built on, but almost none are built with. The ground itself, the foundation of it all. Most people think of the ground as something that simply follows the weather. Cold air arrives, the surface freezes, the earth becomes cold. That assumption feels logical because it matches what we can see. Frost forms on soil, snow settles and stays. Dig just a little, and the dirt feels cold to the touch. So it's easy to believe that the cold goes all the way down. But it doesn't. Not in the way most people imagine. Because temperature doesn't move through the ground the same way it moves through air. Air reacts quickly. It heats fast, cools fast, shifts constantly. The ground does the opposite. It changes slowly. It resists sudden shifts. It absorbs energy, stores it, and releases it over time. And that difference changes everything. A few centimeters below the surface, temperature still fluctuates, but go deeper half a meter, 2 meters, and something interesting begins to happen. The variation fades. The sharp swings disappear. The ground settles into a narrow temperature range that barely moves, even as seasons change above it. In many regions, that stable temperature sits somewhere around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Not warm, not cold, just steady. In winter, that's significantly warmer than the air outside. In summer, it's cooler, which means the ground isn't just neutral. It's a buffer, a slow, massive reservoir that resists extremes. Now imagine placing a home inside that environment, not on top of it, fully exposed to air but partially or entirely surrounded by it. Suddenly, the rules change. Because the walls are no longer facing unstable air on all sides, they're facing something that barely changes at all. Instead of heat constantly escaping into freezing air, it moves into soil that is already relatively stable. And because that soil doesn't drop rapidly in temperature, the heat loss slows down dramatically. Not because insulation improved, but because the environment around the home became more stable. That's the first shift. The second is even more important. The ground doesn't just slow heat loss, it stores heat. Think of it like this. If you leave a metal object outside overnight in winter, it becomes cold quickly. It has very little capacity to store heat, and it exchanges energy with the air almost instantly. Now compare that to a large stone. Leave it outside, and it changes temperature much more slowly. It absorbs energy during the day, releases it at night, and resists rapid shifts. The ground behaves more like the stone, but on a much larger scale. It absorbs heat when it's available, from sunlight hitting the surface, from warmer seasons, from the home itself. And once that heat is inside the soil, it doesn't disappear quickly. It lingers. It moves slowly. It creates a delayed response that smooths out extremes. This is what turns the surrounding Earth into something closer to a thermal battery. Not a battery that charges and discharges instantly, but one that holds energy over long periods and releases it gradually. And when a home is built into that system, it begins to benefit from that stored stability. Instead of constantly losing heat into a volatile environment, it's interacting with something that already holds energy. Something that doesn't demand constant replenishment. Something that quietly supports the internal temperature without needing to be switched on. This is why underground or earth-sheltered homes don't behave like conventional ones. They aren't just insulated differently. They are connected to a completely different thermal system. In a typical house, heat is produced and then protected from loss. In an earth-sheltered home, heat is both protected and supported by the surrounding mass. That distinction matters, because it reduces the need for constant input. Not entirely, no structure is perfectly self-sustaining, but significantly enough that the difference becomes obvious over time. Heating systems still exist in many of these homes, but they operate differently, less frequently, less urgently, more as a backup than a primary driver of comfort. And that's where the idea of free heat starts to make sense. It's not that heat appears from nowhere. It's that the structure stops losing it so aggressively that very little needs to be added in the first place. The system shifts from active generation to passive retention, from constant correction to quiet stability. But there's one more layer to this, because the depth matters. A house that is slightly buried behaves differently from one that is deeply integrated into the ground. The deeper the structure interacts with stable soil temperatures, the stronger the buffering effect becomes. Orientation matters too. South-facing exposure, in colder climates, allows sunlight to enter and contribute additional warmth. That heat doesn't just warm the air, it gets absorbed into interior surfaces and, over time, into the surrounding mass. Which means the system isn't isolated. It's interactive. It gathers energy when it's available, stores it, and releases it slowly. All without mechanical intervention. And once you see it clearly, it stops feeling like a trick. It starts feeling like alignment. The structure isn't fighting the environment. It's using it. Working with the natural behavior of materials instead of trying to overpower them with external systems. which leads to an uncomfortable realization. Because nothing about this is new. There's no advanced technology required to understand it. No recent breakthrough that suddenly made it possible. The physics has always been there. The ground has always behaved this way. And humans have known about it for a very long time. Long before modern insulation standards. Long before centralized heating systems. Long before energy bills became a seasonal expectation. So if the mechanism is this simple, and the behavior is this reliable, then the real question becomes harder to ignore. Why did we move away from it in the first place? Long before thermostats, before insulation ratings, before centralized heating systems became standard, people were already solving the same problem. Not with machines, but with placement. In regions where winters were harsh and resources were limited, building above ground wasn't always the obvious choice. Exposure meant vulnerability. Wind stripped heat quickly. Materials had limits. And fuel, when it was available, came at a cost in labor, time, or survival risk. So, instead of fighting the environment, many early structures did something simpler. They stepped into it. Across different parts of the world, separated by geography and culture, similar solutions appeared. In colder climates, homes were partially or fully embedded into the ground. Thick earth walls surrounded living spaces. Roofs were layered with soil or natural materials. Entrances were positioned to reduce wind exposure. These weren't aesthetic decisions. They were functional. Because once a structure is surrounded by earth, it stops reacting to the outside world in the same way. The wind loses its leverage, temperature swings soften, the internal space becomes more predictable. And predictability, in extreme conditions, is survival. Take the pit houses used by various indigenous communities in North America. Built below ground level, often covered with wood and earth, they created interior environments that remained far more stable than the air outside. In winter, they held warmth. In summer, they stayed cool. Or the underground dwellings found in parts of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, where entire living spaces were carved into soil or rock. These structures didn't rely on constant fuel consumption. They relied on mass, placement, and the natural behavior of the ground. Even in regions with intense heat rather than cold, similar logic applied. In places like Northern Africa and the Middle East, homes were built partially underground, or with thick earth walls to resist daytime heat. The goal was the same: reduce exposure to extremes by using the environment itself as a buffer. Different climates. Same principle. Stability over reaction. This wasn't isolated knowledge. It was widespread, repeated, refined over generations. Which makes what happened next more interesting. Because as construction methods evolved, brick, steel, glass, standardized materials, the relationship between buildings and the ground began to change. Homes moved upward. They became more exposed, more dependent on controlled inputs rather than environmental alignment. This wasn't necessarily a mistake. It brought advantages: faster construction, easier expansion, more flexibility in design, better access to light and views. But it also introduced something new: dependency. Because once a structure is fully exposed, it loses the buffering effect of the earth. Every wall becomes a boundary between interior comfort and exterior instability, and that boundary has to be actively managed. Heating systems compensate for winter. Cooling systems compensate for summer. Insulation slows the exchange, but doesn't eliminate it. And over time, that model became the standard. Not because it was the most efficient in every condition, but because it fit other priorities: urban expansion, uniform construction methods, market scalability, financing structures that favored predictable, repeatable designs. The system shifted from working with environmental stability to managing environmental instability. But even as that shift took place, the older approach didn't disappear entirely. It resurfaced in moments of pressure. During the energy crises of the 1970s, interest in earth-sheltered homes returned in parts of the United States and Europe. Rising fuel costs forced a reconsideration of how buildings handled heat. Suddenly, the idea of using the ground as a thermal buffer wasn't just historical, it was practical again. Architects and engineers began experimenting with designs that integrated soil, thermal mass, and passive solar orientation. Studies showed reduced energy consumption. Real-world examples demonstrated consistent performance. Some of these homes achieved dramatic reductions in heating needs. Not theoretical reductions. Measured ones. Lower bills, more stable interiors, less reliance on mechanical systems. And yet, despite this validation, the movement never became dominant. It remained niche. Adopted by certain builders, certain regions, certain individuals willing to step outside conventional models but never fully integrated into mainstream construction. Which brings us to the present. Because today, the knowledge still exists. The physics hasn't changed. Modern materials have improved, design tools are more advanced, construction techniques are more precise. In many ways, building an earth-sheltered home now is easier than it has ever been, and examples continue to prove the concept. Homes that maintain stable indoor temperatures through winter with minimal heating input. Structures that use the surrounding earth not as a barrier to overcome, but as a resource to work with. Quietly, consistently, they perform. So the question shifts again. If this isn't new, if it has been tested across centuries, if modern versions continue to validate it, then the limitation isn't knowledge, it isn't capability, and it isn't proof, which means the barrier must exist somewhere else. Not in how these homes function, but in how they fit into everything built around them. A house that barely needs heating doesn't just behave differently, it fits differently. Not physically, but structurally, inside the systems that decide what gets built, approved, financed, and repeated. Because modern housing doesn't operate in isolation, it sits inside a layered framework of rules, expectations, and incentives, and those layers were not designed around homes that minimize dependency. They were designed around homes that require it. Start with something simple: building codes. Most codes are written around standard construction methods, above-ground structures, conventional materials, predictable layouts. They define how walls are framed, how roofs are supported, how moisture is managed, how ventilation is achieved. These rules are not arbitrary. They exist to prevent failure. But they are also based on what is common. And underground or earth-sheltered homes don't always fit cleanly into those categories. Waterproofing becomes more complex. Drainage has to be carefully engineered. Structural loads from surrounding soil behave differently than loads from air and wind. Ventilation requires a different approach. None of this is impossible. But it is non-standard, which means approvals can take longer, inspections can become more detailed, designs may need to be customized rather than copied from existing templates. That alone slows things down. Now add financing. Banks and lenders rely on comparables similar homes in similar areas that establish a predictable market value. This is how risk is calculated. But if a home is uncommon, finding those comparisons becomes difficult. How do you price something that doesn't have many equivalents? How do you assess resale value? How do you predict buyer demand for something most people have never lived in? From a lender's perspective, uncertainty increases risk. And increased risk changes the terms. Higher scrutiny, more documentation, sometimes higher costs, sometimes hesitation, altogether. Not because the structure doesn't work, but because the system doesn't know how to categorize it. Insurance follows a similar pattern. Traditional homes come with established data, decades of claims, performance under stress, known failure points. That data allows insurers to model risk with some confidence. Earth-sheltered homes don't always fit into those models. Questions arise. How does long-term moisture behave? What happens under extreme rainfall? How does soil pressure interact with structural elements over decades? Again, these questions have answers. Engineers understand them. Builders have solved them. But standardized data is thinner. And when data is limited, pricing becomes cautious. Now step back and look at the broader construction ecosystem. Large parts of the industry are built around repetition. Standardized materials, standardized labor practices, standardized timelines. A conventional home can be built using well-established supply chains. Contractors know the sequence, crews know the methods. Materials arrive pre-sized, prefabricated, optimized for speed. An earth-sheltered home interrupts that rhythm. Excavation becomes more significant. Waterproofing systems require precision. Structural design may need to account for lateral soil pressure in ways that typical homes don't. It's not that it's harder in an absolute sense. It's that it's different. And difference introduces friction. Friction slows adoption. Then there's the question of incentives. Modern housing, in many cases, operates within a model of ongoing interaction. Energy is consumed. Services are billed. Systems are maintained. Upgrades are added over time. There is continuous economic activity tied to the life of the home. Now consider a structure that reduces a portion of that activity. Lower heating demand, less reliance on constant energy input, fewer dramatic fluctuations that require intervention. From the homeowner's perspective, that's an advantage. From a system perspective, it changes the flow, and systems tend to favor what fits their existing patterns. This doesn't require coordination or intent. It emerges naturally. If most professionals are trained on one type of building, they will recommend that type. If most financial models are built around certain assumptions, they will favor those assumptions. If most buyers are familiar with a certain kind of home, they will feel more comfortable choosing it. Familiarity reinforces itself. Standardization reinforces itself. And anything outside that loop has to overcome an additional layer of hesitation, not because it fails, but because it isn't the default. Even perception plays a role. Underground or earth-sheltered homes can trigger associations that have nothing to do with their actual performance. People imagine darkness, confinement, lack of ventilation. But modern designs often include large front exposures, skylights, open layouts, controlled airflow features that address those concerns directly. Still, perception lags behind reality. And perception influences demand. Demand influences supply. Supply influences what gets built next. So the cycle continues. Not as a deliberate exclusion, but as a structural outcome. The result is something subtle. A type of home that works. That has been proven. That continues to perform quietly wherever it's built. But that doesn't scale in the same way as more conventional structures. Not because it can't, but because it doesn't align perfectly with the systems that determine what becomes common. Which leads to the final layer of the question. Because once you see all of this together, the physics, the history, the performance, and the resistance, it becomes clear that the issue isn't visibility. It isn't secrecy. It's alignment. And that raises something deeper. What happens when a solution is effective, but doesn't fit the system it's supposed to exist inside?